the sync up as a whole, I don't want to speak for anyone here, but like the sync up for me is like probably the most interesting news for any card game I've got in a while,
Yeah.
because like we had talked about drafts and stuff like that, where it's like you lose a lot of that experience if you aren't doing the draft thing, or like playing Digimon with rainbow rules. Like it's fun, it's really niche. It doesn't really merit a lot of things, but I think you can appreciate cards more when you have something like that. So hopefully that kind of like encourages that, or like the cooking everyone's gonna have to be doing on these lists, because you can't just look at Japan. They're like, cool, what one? Oh, green color only tournament. That's what we do. Like these things, hopefully, should feel a lot more sealed and a lot more like almost like private events when you're going to these tournaments. I think, and like there's gonna be a lot of like tech cards that I think people hold back and don't tell people about until like the lists go up.
So, it's funny that you say that. Yes, I think that with Digimon, like, yeah, like there is no, oh, before all this stuff comes out, this is going to be the best deck in the format. And we know because Japan plays like this. Now, granted, it's a trap 90% of the time with Digimon when people say that, right? Like, because players outside of Japan play so differently, it's just different. But, like, you won't have that conversation anymore, right? It'll be like Dragon Ball Masters, where everybody is trying to figure out, like, what's the deck? Have you really solved the deck? And I don't think that any deck in Masters really gets solved, right? There's always room for like super spicy techs or whatever, or people putting their own flair on these decks. And no two lists, at least in the Dragon Ball world, are the same, right? Like I don't think I've ever seen a list where they're one for one the same. Either the side deck has some dramatic different changes, or there's like those key cards that are different. In Digimon, no, there's a lot of lists where it's like that's the exact same list. It's all about like the pilot, whether that be you net decked, which I don't think is a bad thing at all, but like
No.
you're not really encouraged to try your own thing because there's too much data about what has worked overseas for like half a year, right? So like there's no reason to really try and be different outside of, oh, my local does things slightly different, or oh, like just the meta is slightly different, so we need to change this and the third. But there isn't as much like need to really investigate and try new things and all that stuff because you've already seen somebody else do it and it either failed or it worked very well.
And to that point, I'm glad you brought all that up because I wanted to tack on to that because I know I've done it. I've looked at Japan lists of 2 or 3 sets ahead of because I want to start planning like, okay, if I'm going to build this deck, because it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, in order to play this deck I have to go back and get like a card from 6 sets ago or whatever it is, but just to kind of gauge what it's going to be at. But now, like you said, with this unifying of set releases and everybody being on the same schedule and everything. But you brought up the point of, Japan players play a lot different than like, North American players. I wonder if that dichotomy is still going to be there. So it's like, okay, Japan players are still going to play what they're going to play, right? Regardless of where they're at set wise, right? Now they may still they may alter certain things or whatever. But let's say for the sake of argument they keep the same way that they do, and they have a tournament or a regional on a Friday night, and we have one on a Sunday morning, and they're released. It's kind of like looking at those things like, okay, are we going to still try to go based off a Japan list? Or are we going to, as North American players, are we going to alter what we're doing? So I'm interested to see the dynamic between, Japan players and North American players now that we are on the same, if there's going to be that, oh, we're going to kind of base our list off of that, or if we're now going to have to get a lot more creative, like you said, with like Dragon Ball players, like we're just testing and trying to figure out what's going to work best. We don't have to do that Digimon right now because Japan does it, and then we just look at it and be like, okay, we're just going to kind of tweak it a little bit, and then the lists are mostly the same. So I'd be curious to see like how that affects deck building across the board, like globally for everybody.
I could actually see that being really interesting because it goes to a dedication perspective. Like if you're trying to be competitive, like you need to see those lists. Hopefully that also makes like every event matter just a little bit more. Like obviously I only really care about stuff in my region unless I'm going to like Digi meta and then looking at decks that have been like going around the world or like locals or whatever. Hopefully that encourages the idea of like those who are really about it. And then also I think the spoiler scene and the investment scene are really gonna change for Digi. The spoilers, I really hope they do it just the Dragon Ball way of like, here's 2 cards, enjoy. And that gives you that magic situation right now where we're slowly learning all the cards as like they're coming, but they don't drop big stuff until near the end. And then you're going to draft that Friday as like you just learned every card by like Wednesday. And you may have read every card, but like actually getting them on the table, testing them, it's completely different. So that's going to be interesting to read a list and be like, did that work because of what the region he's in, or do you let that affect your ratios? I'm like, oh, I thought like 2 was good, but this guy's running. Does that create a 12th hour switch up in a list that you resubmit to a tournament that you're in? And then investment scene, I think, is going to be really weird. I'm hoping that this really does drive a little bit more investment capital into Digimon, because right now, like, only really SRs appreciate for a bunch of stuff, and then you can have cards that are money, like Lugumon, and then like he's gone. Like, I just don't really see it anymore, and it's like its value has dropped significantly. But hopefully this makes, like, did you invest in Chimeramon back in BT8? Well, good, because like he's insane money now, because we don't know what's going to be hype, and then when people start figuring out what is hype, you'll have those weird like uncommon like fluxes in price and stuff like that.
Well, it's funny that you bring up the investment thing, because I was just thinking that, right? So like to tack onto that, like yes, but also too, you don't have like the hype trains, right? So like you don't have like the random Shine Greymon is now $60. You're like, why is he $60? I don't understand. Which I think is a good thing, and I wouldn't say a bad thing at all simultaneously, but it's like there's a pros and a cons there, right? Of like, okay, that also means that like y'all got to be paying attention to like if you have a TCG Player store or you do stuff on eBay, you really got to pay attention to like what's going on and try and like use your own prognostication to figure out like, oh damn, I think this is going to be worth something because I see a combo, I see the vision for Omnimon here that other people may not see. It also makes it so that like, kind of back to what we were saying too about like deck building, and Dan, what you were saying about like the list. Now, when a tournament happens, instead of just looking at one region, I mean, okay, it's not one when we look, but like there's a new region for us to like look at, and for everybody to trade information and figure things out as they happen, which is and just different than how it's been done. I mean, again, it's like Dragon Ball Masters now, and I think also you might get people who are much more protective of their lists, right? Because now your list is your list, right? Like you might be the only person playing that version of the deck, because like no one, unless you posted it, right? But like there was no one else, no research. I think it makes pre-release more interesting, to your point, because okay, I haven't been practicing BT17 for 6 months before it came out, right? Because now people do that shit all the time. There's nothing wrong with that, but like they basically play Japan's meta while we're in BT15. And like when you go to a pre-release or you go to these other events where people who may not be that committed, or not even committed, who don't do that because that's just not how they do things, like that person now has an advantage because you know every card in the set, you know everything that like happens, you know all the interactions, you know everything there is to know. And that can be problematic in terms of, I wouldn't say for the health of the game, but it makes it harder for people who don't want to do all that research or don't have the time to do that research to be competitive, right? Now we're all on like the same playing field. We all got to do the same amount of work to really understand what these cards do and how they interact.